Okay, if you can just give me your name, actually.
My name is Louise Firouz.
Mm-hmm. And where are we now?
We're in Ateshe on the Turkmen steppes in the northeastern part of Iran, right near the border with Turkmenistan.
And this is really the heart of horse country.
For Iran, it is, yes, the heart of horse country. I think the horse has always been used here and bred here, and some of, well, probably Iran's finest horses come from here.
Mm-hmm.
پدر من وکیل بر ایران بود بعد از جنگ جهانی دوم موقعی که روسا نرفتن بیرون از آذربایجان پس ما خیلی آشنا شدیم به حسین علا آمدم فریدون رو ببینم فامیل حسین علا ببینم بعد اون موقع آشنا شدم به نرسی فیروز که رفتیم شیراز اینو دیدم و منم خیلی علاقمند به تمام این منطقه شدم. بعد که آمدم اینجا فهمیدم که ایران چه اسب خوبی داره. آمدم اینجا دیدم که واقعا اسب ایران عجیب غریبه دیگه. I did move up here 20 years ago for a variety of different reasons, and set up this stud farm with my late husband. But first we raised mainly Caspian ponies, and then we started raising these purebred Turkmen. نه ده همه جایم نیست. خب من چرا نرفتم امریکا؟ من چرا موندم اینجا؟ از من میپرسن. من دیگه چه خوب راحتم اینجا. خیلی خوبه شما میخوان گرین کارت بگیرید برید امریکا برو. ولی اینجا برای من خوبه. خیلی دوستش دارم.
It's a horse culture area, certainly historically. Do you ever look out over the mountain and think, well, it's time to go, time to get on the horse and...
Oh, the thought has occurred to me, actually, on a couple of different occasions. And then every time it does, and I look around the world, I've decided that I'm in the best place anyway.
And it's a great place for doing riding expeditions.
Oh, it would be fantastic. That's right. It's the horses that have really always captured my imagination in Iran, although Iran itself is such a fantastically beautiful country. I was actually looking for some ponies for my children when I ran across these little horses up on the Caspian Sea. And my husband and I bought a couple of them, and the children started to ride them, and then we started to wonder, well, where did they come from? It was what originally got me really interested in the history and the whole area of Iran, the Middle East, was the horses. And it was the research into the horses that then pulled me up with the ancient civilizations, the Scythians, the Achaemenians, the Parthians, because they dealt with exactly the same horses that we're dealing with today. In fact, during the time of the Parthians, I'm told that the main racehorses in Sparta came from this area. And for sure, Alexander may have killed off the people, but he certainly took their horses, and I'm sure Chinggis Khan did the same.
So the horses went east to China, and up to Mongolia, and west into
Europe. Right.
There's even suggestion that Bucephalus, Alexander's horse, was perhaps from here, or certainly descended from Turkoman horse.
It's possible. They had such a good reputation that I imagine that Alexander would only have been satisfied with the best. The Oriental horse was developed, what you know as the Oriental horse really is probably the Arab and the types of horses that you find in the Arab countries. That was developed as a result of a crossing of the native pony of the Zagros, now we call it the Caspian, and the Turkoman horse, which is a breed that embraces the Yarmout and the Guklan and the Akhal Teke together.
There's been a lot of work done with chromosome typing, with DNA typing.
There has, by Dr. Gus Cawthorn of the University of Kentucky. We've sent him blood from all of the various different breeds of horses in Iran, and he's compared them with blood he's taken from Europe and the United States. And his conclusion is that the same conclusion we reached working on bones from archaeological sites, that the most ancient forms of the Oriental horse are the Turkoman and the Caspian pony.
So it's quite contentious what you're saying, because for for centuries, people said the Arab is a breed. Some people suggested the Arab was a species completely separate from other horses. And this is wrong.
That's wrong. No, it's Equus cavus. It has 64 chromosomes. The problem is that I, frankly, don't think there ever was anything called the Arab. I think it was a group of strains, because it's an awfully large geographical area to have all the same breed. So it was the Koilan and the Hamdani and the Seglavi. I don't know all the various different types. But the Arab has been developed by Westerners who took them abroad and bred them without reference to their individual strains the way the Arabs bred them. And so they called it the Arab. I don't think the Arabs call it the Arab. And in fact, Iran is not called the Arab either. It's called the Asil, which means purebred.
We know exactly what this horse is now, but as I said, it took 40 years of study to identify these original types of Oriental horse.
So she's a fossil, really?
Well, yes, and in
whom
fact,
you rediscovered?
Yes.
Well, I was going to say, have you come head-to-head fist-fighting with the Arab Horse Society and Arab enthusiasts in Saudi Arabia, for instance?
Yeah, no, I haven't. I stay far away from politics of that sort. That's up to them. They can either accept this whole thing or not accept it, and if it doesn't suit them to not accept it, it's fine. But it's fact.
And it's been borne out by archaeology, by biology,
right,
by oral history. It's
and
pretty much irrefutable.
Genetics, it is irrefutable. I'm still finding out what it is, and I'm not so sure whether I'm saving anything or not. I think what I'm doing is having a good time. But in the meantime, also corresponding with a number of people abroad, like with people like Bonnie Hendricks and Gus Cothran, and slowly we've put together a picture of what the horse was, what his genetic makeup is, and how the whole picture fits into the Oriental horse. So in fact, we have solved the mystery of whence the Arab. Well, in their own environment, they're capable of traveling great distances over a very harsh country with no water, because they have a very meatless body, and they're kept that way, sweated down with these felt blankets. Abroad, and particularly with the Russians, they've been capable of incredible feats of jumping and also dressage. So I suppose, taken to the West, they could be used for any one of the sports, whether it's endurance riding or dressage or jumping.
What are the defining qualities? What would you see in a typical horseman here and horse in the way of trappings and saddlery and so on and so forth?
Well, first of all, you probably wouldn't even see the horse because he's covered with a felt. And second, ridden by a man, very seldom by women. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a woman on a horse here, although I'm sure they did in the old days. And the men wear sheep skin hats, caracole, I guess it's called, isn't it? The bridles are always snaffles, and the saddle is a small, high-cantled, high-pommeled saddle that's made by themselves.
And what do you hope for the breed in the coming years, in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm going to be around for another 10, 20 years, but I hope that they will become popular again in Iran so that there's a good market for them, so that more Turkomans will keep them.
And personally, this is a very satisfying thing to have done. Everybody always thinks in their lives that, oh wow, I'd like to do something, make a little mark. I don't want to just be a passenger on this world. I want to have contributed something in my life. And this is my contribution, this horse.
Apparently, it's quoted in the Quran that every grain of barley you feed to a horse is a step closer to heaven.
Well, you should be very close at this point.
I know, it's wonderful, about to slip in.
We want to welcome you to our program today. We are so delighted and pleased that you made time to do this presentation for us. So with all due apologies for the delay, Ateshe, go ahead with your presentation.
Okay. So my name is Ateshe Firouz. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody and thank you so much for your patience for all this technology problems we seem to be having. So tonight I'm going to tell you about the life of Louise Firouz, Banlieue Sarzamin I.E.S.E, or the Lady of the Land of Horses. And so far as possible, I'll try and do so in her words. Okay. Let's not go into the next one. There we are. Louise Elizabeth Leyland was born in Washington in 1933. She passed away in 2008 in the Turkoman steppes of northern Iran. This is the story of her life. When she was 6 years old, her family moved to a small rural market town just outside of Washington, D.C. They bought a rundown old pre-Civil War house with a traditional red barn. In those days, they would ride to school on horseback along forest trails. She would tell us, "We found it hard to abandon the horses, so instead we abandoned school." On her way home from having spent the day swimming in the Potomac River with friends, they'd stop for a snack at Buck Warner's, the village store. Years later, we would do the same thing on the back of 2 Caspian ponies that were spending the summer in Virginia on their way to Bermuda. After her parents' divorce, Louise and her mother moved to a small farm in New Hampshire. In the winter, the roads became impassable. So for transportation, Louise would harness up her little Morgan mare to a sleigh. That definitely left its mark on her, as she used to say, "Getting up in the dark each morning to hitch up the mare and drive the 10 miles to school has given me a lifelong aversion to rising in the dark." Louise enrolled at Cornell University's Agricultural College with a veterinary career in mind. The courses were difficult, though, and she ended up defeated by physics, turning to the classics instead. She was also very interested in learning Arabic, so she decided to take a year off to go study at the American University of Beirut. Louise's father, John Leyland, was an international lawyer, and at the time he was involved in the case of Iran versus the Soviet Union, argued in the United Nations after World War II. It was a long and complicated case, which gave the Iranian ambassador at the time, Ambassador Hossein Allah, ample time to become good friends with the Leyland family. His son Feridun and the Leyland children began a lifelong friendship. So when Feridun extended an invitation for Louise to go to Iran for a visit, she eagerly accepted. This is how she described it. "I'd been fascinated by Feridun's tales of Persia. Everything that I'd heard about the Orient intrigued me, the horses, the bazaars, the palaces, and the bleak landscape." This is a picture of Ambassador Hossein Allah, and on his right is Narsi Firouz, who you'll meet in the next slide. Louise was met at the airport by Feridun, who took her to the family's garden in the north of Tehran. The Allahs were hosting a dinner for her that evening. Narsi Firouz, a civil engineer working in Shiraz, was visiting Tehran, and he was also invited. His brother Iskandar was married to Feridun's sister. Narsi and Louise were immediately drawn together, and before returning to Shiraz the following morning, Narsi invited Louise and Feridun for a visit, and he organized a special boar hunt in Dasht Arjan, the Valley of the Lions. That evening, looking over Dasht Arjan, clear and bright in the moonlight, Narsi suggested they get married. Louise returned to Cornell to finish her studies before joining Narsi in Shiraz. At the time, he was working as the chief engineer at the Namazi Hospital. He bought 15,000 hectares in a valley to the south of Shiraz in an area called Siyah. Siyah means 30 frosts in Persian. They planted fruit trees and wheat and built a small house and a stable. They spent many hours on horseback riding through the plains and the surrounding valleys. They also bought a small farm near Shiraz, which they called Little Lou, and they started a chicken business. Louise was given a black Bosseri stallion as a wedding present, which she named Kyrie Eleza. Together with Narcis's beautiful Qashqai stallion, which you'll see on the right of this slide, called Albert, and a couple of mares they bought, they began breeding the horses. During those years in Shiraz, they came to know the Qashqai people very well, accompanying them often on their migrations. Iran's nomadic Qashqai, which are part of the Turkic tribes from Central Asia who settled in Iran during the 11th and 12th centuries, have roamed the harsh deserts of the area for hundreds of years. Each year they travel on horseback with their flocks of sheep and goats from their summer highland pastures near Shiraz to the north, to their winter pastures on the lower and warmer lands near the Persian Gulf. The farm at Siach was eventually taken over by the army, and Narcy and Louise decided to move the family to Tehran. By then they had 3 children, 2 daughters, Roshan and Ateshe, and a son, Karen. And you can see their children never stopped them from going on the migrations. They were just strapped to the back of a horse and went along with them. Narcy's father, Mohammad Hossein Mirza, gave them a property that had been in the family for some time. Noruzabad, as it was called, was 140 hectares of barren land about a half an hour to the west of Tehran. Nowruz is the word for the vernal equinox in Persian and means new day. Abad in Persian means to develop or to cultivate. Louise's impression with the land was the actual opposite. She said, there was very little to recommend the situation. On all sides of us, empty rocky desert stretched to the trees of distant villages on the lower slopes of the Ateshe Mountains of the Alburz range. They rented a small house in Tehran close to the Firouz construction company and the Iran Swiss school where they entered their 3 children. For 3 years, they juggled their lives between Tehran and Nourzabad, where they were busy trying to develop the land. The climate was harsh, oscillating between sub-zero temperatures in the winter to scorching heat in the summer. They planted trees, lots of them, and added humus to a soil which was absolutely devoid of organic matter. The children also began to ride, and that's where they ran into trouble, because the spirited stallions they had were much too much for them, and they couldn't handle them, so they decided to look for smaller, more suitable horses for them. Pictured, you see the horses in the first stable they built in Nourzabad. This is Nourzabad a few years after they'd started developing it, so you can see the trees that they planted. At the time, the Arabian horse was very well known, but any information about the rest of the Middle East or Central Asia was virtually non-existent. There were no books that could shed any light at all on the equine diversity, which was all around Louise at the time. But she did remember seeing smaller horses grazing on the harvested rice paddies on a visit to the Caspian the previous year. So with 3 friends, she set off in their Jeep to the Caspian. They ended up in the coastal town of Amol, where they abandoned the Jeep to have a look around. A young student who'd overheard them asking the locals if they knew of any small horses decided he was going to take charge. So he led them through the streets of Amol, through the traffic, through the donkeys pulling carts of wares, and through the different bazaars, until finally they emerged into a courtyard where Louise said there was a horse covered with cement dust attached to a crude wooden cart. He was about 11 hands tall, which is 110 centimeters, more or less, slim with tiny ears and large, bold eyes. He had fine legs and small hooves. He wasn't a fat, shaggy pony. He was a beautiful horse. Needless to say, they bought the horse. She said, the small horse we now owned was puzzling. It was the size of a pony, but it definitely did not fit the description of a pony. It was a perfectly formed miniature horse. So there seemed to be more questions than answers at this point. The reputation of the traveling party was preceding them as word of 4 foreign women in a jeep looking for small horses started to spread. They met many people in many small villages on that first trip. People in Iran are extremely hospitable, so many a cup of tea was sipped in huts like the one you see in the slide that are beautifully adorned in hand-embroidered material from Gilan and Mazandaran. There'd always be a samovar gently simmering in one corner or another. They were having tea on the porch of one such hut when a horse dealer they'd picked up along the way entered the yard, leading a little chestnut stallion. He was another perfect specimen of a miniature horse. Mamad Ali, the horse dealer that seemed to have adopted them, was puzzled why sometimes they would say yes to a horse and sometimes they'd say no, even though the horses seemed to be the same size. But Louise had to admit that they couldn't really explain the difference either. But what they did know was that they were interested in the small, slim, and fine-boned horses, while the ones that resembled shaggy Mongol ponies had no particular distinction. Having spent a number of days trudging through the mud looking for ponies, they decided they needed a change of scenery. They'd heard that somewhere to the east of the Caspian was an area known as the Turkoman Steppes. Horse people in Tehran spoke of these Turkmens and their horses with awe. So they abandoned Mamad Ali in search of the Turkomans. He promised that he'd take care of the ponies that were being kept in the caravanserai. They reached the Turkoman town of Gorgan sometime in the late afternoon. The Turkoman Steppes is very different from Gilan and Mazandaran. You'll see men wandering down the streets with these big astrakhan hats, and the women that wear these large tunics of red, mostly red, with very flowery and colorful scarves. Many years later, Narcy and Louise would buy land and settle far off on the Turkoman steppe and grow to know the Turkoman people very well. So just so I don't lose you along the way, I thought I'd show you these 2 maps. The one on the left is of Iran and shows the location of all the places I'm talking about in the presentation, with Shiraz in the south, Nuruzabad just to the south of Tehran, Khordan just to the west of Tehran. Amul and Babol are 2 cities on the eastern part of the Caspian Sea, or the easternmost part. And the Turkoman Steppes, which is in the northeast part of Iran. I also wanted to show you a map of the size, a comparative size map of Iran and the USA, just to give you an idea of the country and the kind of distances we're talking about. So after spending a few days in the market town of Pahlavidej, the 4 intrepid women returned to Babol. They were supposed to meet their truck driver in the caravanserai, where the 2 ponies were being stabled, but on the way decided to stop in a small hamlet near Babol, and they found a little mare almost immediately. Louise describes her. She was beautiful but thin and covered with parasites. She was a little bay mare, and we called her Alamara. Her place in the history of Caspian horses glitters, because not only is she the first foundation mare, she was also the dam of Mumtaz Mahal, who was eventually given to His Royal Highness Prince Philip and lived for a while at Windsor Castle. So Alamara is the mare pictured in the middle of this slide, and to the right is Mumtaz Mahal, the mare that was given to His Royal Highness Prince Philip. And on the left is a little Caspian stallion called Osman, who you're about to meet. Louise's curiosity and interest regarding the origin of the domesticated horse led her to contact many scientists all around the world to help her understand the nature of this little horse she now owned. She theorized that although the Sumerians and Achaemenians must have selectively bred the small horses, in addition to catching them wild in the Alburz Mountains, I doubt anyone had consciously bred these horses since the Medes. The ponies were an instant success amongst the children, but it quickly became evident that they would soon need more. So a short time later, Louise packed her 2 daughters into the same Jeep and set off for the Caspian. Halfway between Amul and Babul, we stopped beside a hut on the side of a small muddy road. A man emerged and we asked him if he had any small horses. He disappeared behind a pile of manure and soon returned with a tiny gray skeleton of a stallion. The most prominent feature of this emaciated creature was an abundant mane that obscured his eyes and face. We called him Osimon, who was the stallion in the previous slide, and he's also the one in the bottom middle and the top left. On our way back to Babul, we spotted a little bay horse pulling a crude wooden cart with amazing speed. He was a brief vision of elegance before he disappeared down an alley of the Bazar. After parking the car and setting off in pursuit, dodging donkeys staggering under their ways, past the usual spice bazaar, copper bazaar, etc., they were almost out of breath when they rounded the corner, and there he was, standing beside a merchant's stall. Louise approached the man standing beside him and asked him if he'd be willing to sell the horse. She received an emphatic nah. To her dismayed look, he replied that in the 15 years he'd been working in the bazaar, he'd never owned a horse like that. But fortunately, the urge to bargain triumphed over sentiment or reason, and we were soon negotiating, Louise said. The owner of the horse had many good points, but the most irrefutable was that he could not leave his cart full of materials without a way to move it. At that point, another horse appeared around the corner, and we bought it and handed it over to the owner of the bay. A further cash exchange, and we owned Ostad, or the professor. Ostad is pictured at the bottom on the right and the top in the middle, and indeed, he lived up to his reputation of a horse that we hadn't seen in the previous 15 years. By 1965, so 3 years after moving to Nourzabad, breeding of the Caspian horses had begun in earnest. The stallions were used as children's ponies, and the mares went into the breeding program. And the farm was becoming fast abad. The Yaruti grapes and asparagus that had been planted in the first couple of years were fetching premium prices at the market, and the horses were delighting in the pastures of bluegrass and clover that was covering most of the farm at the time. There weren't many competitive equestrian sporting activities, so Louise and Narcy reluctantly filled the void. They organized many equestrian events, such as steeplechases, hunts, paper chases, show jumping events, 3-day events, and much more. In the meantime, Louise became involved in the establishment of the Royal Horse Society, which was set up to recognize and register Iran's unique range of native horses. Louise and Narcy also established the Pony Club in the Farahabad, which were the royal stables at the time, and they set up the Gymkhana Association. It was becoming very clear that the Caspian was indeed a breed of a horse. So Louise established a stud book with a foundation herd of horses that she'd collected and bred. By then, the small nucleus numbered 5 stallions and 6 mares. She embarked upon extensive research with scientists from all around the world. Eventually, evidence would prove that the Caspian was indeed an ancient breed predating all other horses in the region. Exports started in 1966 with Jahan, a beautiful little liver chestnut stallion that was shipped to Virginia to stand as stud. In 1971, 3 Caspians were shipped to Bermuda via Virginia, where they took part in competitions on the Virginia show circuit. Those were the ponies we rode to Buck Warner's, the village store. They were followed by several different shipments to the UK and the setting up of the International Caspian Stud Book. Until the Caspians were sold to the Horse Society in 1974, They were able to breed the mare without crossing back to the same parental lines. That was vital, as the very small numbers of breeding stock was always a constant worry. In 1971, His Royal Highness Prince Philip and Princess Anne were invited to visit the royal stables on their way to attend the festivities of the 2,500 years of royal dynasty. 3 Caspians were presented to Prince Philip for inspection, and you can see them on the right picture on the slide. Louise said he made some astute comments about the wisdom of keeping such a rare herd all in the same place. I was happy to hear this, as I was hoping he would accept the gift of a mare and a stallion, having had similar misgivings myself. The Caspian stud was founded during this time by the Caspian stud UK, was founded during this time by Elizabeth Hayden, now Webster, who had bought the Caspians that had been shipped to Bermuda in 1971. Liz is pictured in the slide here on the left, holding the mare Khurshid Kola that was presented to Prince Philip. Liz worked with her mother Jaffa and Arthur Griffin, and were well aware of the fact that for their venture to work, they needed to have new stock. So the Royal Horse Society gave permission for 4 more horses to be exported. Louise recalls, "Not for the first time, I was struck by the unqualified enthusiasm the British brought to all aspects of their lives, and I was relieved that they were including Caspians. It's no exaggeration to say that the Caspian was saved as a result of their combined efforts. Without their recognition of the potential for the Caspian, we would have had little incentive to augment the pitifully small numbers in our herd." Financial difficulties, however, forced the sale of the herd of Caspians to the Royal Horse Society in 1974. This seemed to be an ideal solution to the problem of preserving them in Iran. It was a logical step, after all, as the Royal Horse Society was established to breed and preserve the native breeds of Iran. Furthermore, it had been agreed that Narcy and Louise would manage the herd and continue with the breeding program. In the end, Norizabad was also included in the sale. And despite the agreement to stay on and manage the breeding of the Caspian for 4 years, they were given 2 weeks to vacate the premises. In Louise's words, this was a traumatic decision, requiring the closure of the riding school in mid-season and finding alternative stabling for approximately 100 horses and a home for ourselves, by the by. The 23 Caspians from the original breeding herd remained. Despite having to move all those horses, herds of sheep, dogs, farm equipment, and children, Louise and Narcy found temporary homes in many different places, ranging from Zarindasht in Karaj to Ajin in Kurdistan, which is all the way to the west of Iran, and from there to the racetrack in Kharbushtareh, just outside of Tehran. While at the racetrack one day, Louise came across an old acquaintance from the Turkoman steppes. He suggested they make the move to Qaravol Khan, which is a place of grassy reaches and rocky ledges on top of a mountain overlooking the Turkoman steppes close to the village of Pashe. Louise remembered the moment very clearly. She said, "With inordinate haste and not personally checking the site, I ordered the necessary trucks and shipped all but the stallions to Pashe. The horses were unloaded and walked the remaining 11 kilometers to the top of the mountain. There was waist-high grass and scattered trees and a limitless view over the Atrek River and the beginning of Central Asia. But so much vegetation must surely require considerable moisture at some time of the year, and the Turkomans soon confirmed the ferocity of the elements. So it seemed that Al Khan was also a temporary solution." The answer to winter shelter came in the form of Qaratepe Sheikh, a village down in the valley devoid of cultivation. This did not deter Louise. Her description is very revealing. Although I was somewhat skeptical about what we could accomplish with 9 hectares of baked steppe, kilometers away from any all-weather roads and near a river whose high banks suggested that it spewed forth more than muddy ooze, we returned to put the proposal to Narsi. Narsi was dubious, but agreed to the project. There was no running water, no electricity, and the only existing road to the town of Calais was across the muddy river. There was no bridge in sight. So they summed up the situation in these words. There are two ingredients. Oh, sorry. Louise and Narsi, before they summed up the situation, I have to tell you that they immediately began preparations for building a barn, which they designed. But they had to keep the cost down, and so they decided to use only local materials, which meant the ground on which they stood and the muddy water from the nearby river. They summed up the situation in these words. Those two ingredients mixed with straw from the previous harvest, and we were well into the construction business. August proceeded with a monotony of mud dumped upon mud, broken by trips to the nearby forest for huge oak logs, which we hauled to the sawmill in Goba de Corbus to be cut into posts and planks for the fence. With what seemed infinite slow motion, the walls of the barn crept upwards towards the sky, and the fence post punctuated the level plane of the steppe. August drew to a close, and September heralded the beginning of Ramadan. The construction of the barn came to a standstill. To compensate for the blistering dry summer, winter fell out of the sky with little warning from autumn. The barn was still lacking a roof, although the poplar rafters and bamboo were piled nearby, ready to be installed. So the Quatre, which was the village chief, was told that they had an emergency on their hands. He immobilized the whole village, and in 2 days, the barn had a roof. On the right of the slide, you'll see the whole village proudly standing in front of the barn with a new roof. On the left in the slide, you can see Louise in front of her hut, which is a place she preferred to live. It was a one-room hut which had a kitchen, bedroom, and living area, and what she liked in every room, a fireplace. After the sale of the Caspians to the Royal Horse Society, Louise and Narsi were left with a single Caspian, Oseman, a little gray stallion. So she found no reason to stop breeding Caspians and set off to the Caspian to see if she could find some mares. She returned with 2 plus a little stallion, which she rather aptly called Prince Caspian. In 1977, he graced the stage of the Rudaki Hall in the Sadler's Well Ballet. Oh, sorry, I'll go back to that slide. So winters in GTS, which is Ateshe, they were spent in GTS because there they grew barley for the horses to graze on. You can see that in the bottom left slide. But by Nowruz, the horses were moved north towards the Ateshe River. The winter there was milder and the grass grew luxuriantly green in the Khalid Nabi Mountains. In early June, though, when the grass ran out, the horses had to be moved up to the hills in Qarabul Khan. Louise describes those moves as, the migration to seasonal pastures was a nightmare of organization. The camp, cooking equipment, tents, alacheiks, all had to be transported to the new locations. Herding the horses from one location to the other was a pleasant, if tiring, occupation. By the spring of 1977, the second herd of Caspians numbered upwards of 20, but they were also joined by a nucleus of Turkoman horses that became a start of a new breeding program. By now their hands were really full, said Louise. Against this background of pastoral activity, we continued to work with the horses, paying particular attention to the 7 Caspians which Elizabeth Hayden and her partners in the UK wanted to import. So after once immersing themselves again in the formalities of trying to export 7 horses, they finally boarded a Caledonian Airlines flight bound for the UK. Upon her return from the UK, Louise is informed that all existing Caspians in Iran are henceforth the property of the Royal Horse Society. This meant that the second herd of Caspians was to be nationalized and taken to the Royal Horse Society facilities. After that incident, Louise stayed on the steppes, paying little attention to the growing dissent in the country, concentrating more on the harvest and raising horses. However, on the advice of the Turkomans and some other locals, she decided that the situation was getting a bit serious. She said there were those of us who thought we could see the storm clouds of revolution looming on some distant horizon back in 1978. But for the most part, the revolution seemed to come as a surprise, even though all the ingredients were visibly there. A number of her books and research on the Caspians were shipped to England, and Louise went abroad for a few months. Upon her return, she was confronted by a spectacle of anarchy. In the ensuing chaos, the Caspian herd in Gombad was woefully neglected and finally auctioned off without the knowledge of the Firouz family. In September 1980, the Postars stormed the house in Tehran, that's the Revolutionary Guards. They blindfolded Louise and Narcy and took them away for interrogation. The interrogation lasted a few weeks. Louise's reaction was, wow, this was one experience I could definitely do without. Upon their return from detention, life in Tehran on the whole seemed to return to the normal frenetic bustle of an Oriental city. But this relative calm was short-lived. The American embassy was stormed and Iraq declared war on Iran. The country mobilized to protect itself. In a very understated way, Louise said, "It was the arrival of the motor of a Scud missile through the roof of our house that persuaded me that I would rather not end my life in Tehran." So in an attempt to escape the missiles, Louise and some friends discovered the little village of Cordon, which was about 20 kilometers to the west of Karaj, so about 60 kilometers to the west of Tehran. They bought a small fruit garden, built a stable, and started the foundations of a house, in that order always. The Cordon River flowed near the farm, and on the other side were the foothills of the Alburz Mountains. There were apple, pear, and cherry trees, which were soon joined by some hens and a vegetable garden. Coupons had been issued during the war, and there was a scarcity of everything ranging from gas to kerosene to basic foodstuffs. So they bought a cow and started making cheese and butter. Although the bulk of the horses were kept in the Turkoman steppes, some of the riding horses were moved to Cordon, and any remaining stalls in the stables were rented out to friends and other boarders. During the wars, the Revolutionary Guards had amassed a large number of confiscated horses at their remount station near Varomi, which is 50 kilometers to the south of Tehran. They contacted Louise and Narcy through a friend and asked if they would be interested in having some of the horses. But it gradually became clear that what they really wanted was a partnership. They'd heard about Caspian horses and their popularity in England, and I think that they envisioned large profits selling these horses abroad. They were kept in 6 enclosures, each containing approximately 300 horses. And although they seemed very well fed, they were completely wild. They were standing knee-deep in a mixture of fine dust and dried manure. And we were supposed to pick out the likely-looking Caspians, and then they were going to send the soldier in to catch them. But the horses were not having any of it and snorted and stampeded as we approached them. And the dust they threw up was absolutely blinding, and the heat was scorching. After each horse was selected, the soldiers were sent in with ropes to catch the unfortunate animal. They would gallop round and round until finally the horse was caught. After a few hours of this scorching heat and choking dust, we managed to leave with 8 horses. Pictured here on the right are the horses arriving in Cordon, still with a lot of energy. There was a lot of work to do with these horses before we were able to even start handling them. And when the Revolutionary Guards realized the time and investment it would take to run the operation, they quickly lost interest, and Narcy and Louise were faced with the purchase of their half of the venture. The 8 original had in the meantime been joined by a number of others in Cordon and were being worked by Louise along with some of the villagers. The pony company was formed and the horses thrived. A permit for the export of 7 horses was finally obtained after many hours of talking, negotiating, and finally using back channels and persuasion, plus the odd favor thrown in. At the time, the Caspians were starting to be exported to the USA, and it seemed like there was a lack of breeding stock in Europe. So Louise attempted to send these horses to the UK. But Iran's new status with the World Organization for Animal Health meant that the horses couldn't travel directly to the EU and would have to be quarantined in Belarus for 6 weeks. 6 months later, the horses finally reached England. This is Louise working with the Caspians in Cordon, and you can see the beautiful Alburz, the snow-capped Alburz Mountains in the background. Unfortunately, Louise and Narcy were not able to recover the cost of the shipment, which left them with a large deficit they could ill afford. The remainder of the herd was moved to GTS, where they could graze outside for most of the year. Soon after, they were bought by the Ministry of Jihad, a branch of the new government dealing with livestock. Then disaster struck. Narcy passed away in the spring of 1994. Louise continued to commute between the property in Cordon and Ateshe. It was a difficult commute. Took about 9 hours on very winding mountain roads. She describes those days. The proceeds of the sale from breeding the Turcoman horses and the funds raising from keeping horses for friends were barely sufficient to keep me afloat, let alone buy fodder for the winter months. I had to find a new way to keep myself and my horses. It had been suggested to her that the amazing rides she organized on a regular basis could be extended to paying visitors. So she contacted a number of equestrian trekking organizations to establish a regular flow of interested visitors. Ruth Staines, who's the current registrar of the British Caspian Society, who went on 5 treks, describes Louise. I was privileged to ride with Louise on a number of occasions. She was a lady who inspired loyalty from horses, dogs, and humans. In a deeply patriarchal society, she was accepted and loved by the local Turkmen. Nothing seemed to faze her. Problems, of which there were many, were simply a part of life to be accepted and overcome. Above all, she was a master of the understatement. These photos were kindly provided by Ruth Staines, who took them from the back, from horseback. There you can see her horse's ears on both these 2 pictures. So what had once been the province of the Turcoman and the Plateau Persian horses was now being replaced by the thoroughbreds and other horses that were imported from Australia and England. And the race distances were now calculated to suit these new imports. And that put the Turcomans at a great disadvantage. And the focus of Iran's riding world in Tehran had also inadvertently switched from its own breeds to those produced by the West. The long-term effect of this program was the almost total disappearance of local breeds in Tehran's sporting scene. And for a country that had been providing the world with the best horses for over 3,000 years, this was a tragedy of major proportions. Louise collected as many of these pure Turcomans as she could and earned herself a very special place in the heart of the Turkmens. She had been instrumental in helping preserve this breed, not only through her breeding program, but also because of the work she did with scientists in collecting and analyzing and comparing DNA samples. Here she's pictured with a horse that she raised and that won a race at the racetrack in Gomba de Kobus. Just so that you notice, there's no women in the grandstand. You rarely see a woman at these races. Louise's herd of Turkomans is now considered the reference for the breed. This is an aerial view of the farm in Ateshe on Turkoman steppes, and the horses on the right and left are her foals. So I put this slide in. It's a timeline of the events that shaped Louise's life from the discovery of the Caspian horse in 1965 until her death in 2008. It's there to give you an idea of the number of tumultuous experiences that Louise faced, each time rebounding to start again. So after the discovery, 8 years later, the nationalization of the original herd of Caspians and the sale of Nourzabad, the farm. Not very long later, they moved to the steppes. 3 years later, they moved to the Turkoman steppes and they start their second herd, which is nationalized the following year. Then the following year, there's the revolution, the Islamic Revolution. And the year after that, the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted 8 years. They moved to Cordon and started the third herd in 1989, the Pony Company herd. And then in 1993, the Pony Company herd is sold to the Jihad. In 1994, she collected a few Caspians because there were a number of people that were interested in importing them, but the last GTS herd was smaller than the previous herds. She had an uncanny way of approaching every setback as an adventure and a challenge. She had a singular character and always seemed to start over with an unending optimism and belief in the success of each endeavor. As her lifelong friend Brenda Dalton described her, Louise had a beguiling personality. She was charming, intelligent, and adventurous. She maintained a dignified elegance and composure, yet she was sociable and fun-loving, with a sharp wit and a ready sense of humor. She had an all-consuming love of horses, an independent spirit, and stubbornly refused to accept defeat. She inspired respect and admiration. Although she did not suffer fools gladly, she had a naive faith in human nature, often misplaced, which worked against her. When she discovered the little unique horse on the plains of the Caspian, she was welcomed with much skepticism. Nonetheless, she contacted archaeologists, paleontologists, and geneticists in order to conduct research that would eventually vindicate her claim that the Caspian horse was the original Oriental horse. After the revolution and the war with Iraq, most people were fleeing the country for the freedom of the West. But the magical pull of the Oriental horse that she called her unicorn kept her in Iran. Louise spent the last years of her life leading trekking expeditions in the Turkoman steppes. Accompanied by 2 Turkoman grooms, whilst another drove the truck filled with tents and food, she'd often ride for 8 to 10 hours at a time. At night, the horses were tethered, and Louise and her guests would share the companionship of local visitors who were always delighted to welcome her and the traveling party. When Louise passed away in the spring of 2008, she was honored by the Turkomans with a Sunni ceremony and laid to rest by her hut amongst her horses and dogs, and surrounded by the vastness of the Turkoman steppes she loved so much. The Setare Golistan newspaper gave her the name Banuye Sarzamin As, the Lady of the Land of Horses. Thank you very much.
So,
Well, thank you so much, Ateshe.